Hello, and welcome to this evening's Brookline Booksmith virtual event with author Lee Kravitz to celebrate the launch of The Last Confessions of Sylvia P. in conversation with Elsa Hart. My name is Rachel, and I'm a bookseller for Brookline Booksmith in Brookline, Massachusetts. To those of you who are familiar with our event series and our store, it's wonderful to have you back. And to all of the new faces, welcome. We're so happy to have all of you here with us tonight as part of our community, and really appreciate your support of fabulous authors and an independent bookstore through your participation and through your book purchases. Now, this evening, we're thrilled to have Lee and Elsa here with us. Moderator Elsa Hart is drawn to stories about travelers throughout history, so perhaps it's not surprising that Elsa is the author of 4 acclaimed historical mystery novels set in China and England in the early 18th century. Her third, City of Ink, was one of Publisher Weekly's best books of 2018. Her fourth, The Cabinets of Barnaby, Mayne, was the 2021 winner of the Simon & Schuster Mary Higgins Clark Award. Thank you so much for being here tonight with us, Elsa. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce you all to Lee Kravitz. Lee teaches fiction and nonfiction at San Francisco Writers Grotto, has lectured at Stanford University's Wallace Stegner Fellowship Program and UC Berkeley's Creative Writing Program, and is co-founder of the Lit Camp Writers Conference with collaborators Jonathan Lethem, Adam Johnson, Andrew Sean Greer, Paul Harding, and Janice Cook Newman. The author of 2 nonfiction books, Strange Contagion and Super Survivors with David B. Feldman. Lee has also written for print and TV outlets, including the New York Times, New York Magazine, The Atlantic, and Sesame Street. Lee has a master's degree in counseling psychology and has held positions at the VA Palo Alto Healthcare System, the National Center for PTSD, and Stanford University Hospital. He lives in San Francisco Bay Area with his wife and children, and we couldn't be happier to have him here with us tonight. So this evening, Lee and Elsa will be sharing conversation about The Last Confessions of Sylvia P. Based on Sylvia Plath's real life leading up to her tragic death and the release of the bell jar, The Last Confessions of Sylvia P is a multi-generational mystery story told from 3 perspectives that begs the question, is it possible to ever truly be known? It's an honor to have Lee and Elsa here with us tonight, so please join me now in welcoming them both.
Thank you, thank you. God, it's great to be here. Elsa, I'm stoked to be here with you. I think it's just wonderful to actually meet you. We actually had a conversation before this, so we got to legitimately meet each other, but it's just super nice to be doing this together. So thank you.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here sharing this moment with you and in Boston virtually, where Sylvia Plath was born and where a lot of your book takes place. So extra special. Last Confessions of Sylvia P. It was such a wonderful book. It's a page turner and it's beautiful, and the structure of it is so elegant. It's the pieces of the story fit together so precisely, kind of like clockwork, but at the same time, there is just so much warmth and emotion in this story. And I'm really happy that I got to read it.
Thank you.
I want to launch right into questions because I have far too many for us to actually cover in this conversation. But first, there is a scene in the book that takes place on a snowy December evening in Boston in the safe holdings room of an auction house. And in this scene, a curator and a sort of crusty professor of literature who has dedicated his career to the works of Sylvia Plath are examining these 3 notebooks that are so fragile they could, fall apart at a single touch. And the curator asks the professor, why Sylvia Plath? And so, Lee, I have the same question for you. Why Sylvia Plath? When did you first encounter her work, and what led you to write a book that about the bell jar?
It's a great question. It's actually it's the question I asked myself actually when I started working on this, like what gives me the right to do this? But I think that the inspiration though really started. I was trying to become a writer, and I couldn't figure out what to write or how to do it. I worked in book publishing for years in New York. And when I turned 30, I sort of decided, well, gosh, I should probably go back to grad school and do something with my life rather than not write. And so I wind up getting a master's in counseling psychology. And I find myself doing some postgraduate work at a mental hospital in Menlo Park. And it just happens to be, just coincidentally, the same mental hospital that Ken Kesey worked at when he was writing One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. And the building I was working in was literally right next door to his old ward, which was all boarded up and basically condemned. I can hear the sirens behind me. I was, sort of working in the ward. And one day there's a kiosk with a bunch of books in it that all the patients would sort of saunter over and read from and take books from. And there were books like Stephen King books and Dean Koontz books and sort of Brad Thor books, these sort of pulp fiction-y sort of cops things, anything to sort of get your mind off of where you're at. Because that's what you have to do in a mental ward. But also the bell jar was there, which I thought was really odd and really wonderful at the same time. And I had read the bell jar when I was much younger. I can't exactly tell you when I had first read it, but it was just sort of always in me. As Sylvia Plath is wont to do when you read her, she's always sort of in your life and in your mind in some way. And I started reading the book again, and it took me about 3 days. And by the time I got to the end, I realized it wasn't just the story it wasn't just the veiled sort of memoir of Sylvia Plath, because in real life, Sylvia, like her character Esther Greenwood, went to a mental hospital when she was about 20 years old, having suffered from a manic depression. We call it bipolar disorder today. And it wasn't just sort of a veiled memoir. What it was also is it was telling the parallel story of the birth of confessional poetry. And what I just found so beautiful and so amazing was that, when we think about when we think about poetry in general today, we think about the raw, sort of emotionally attuned sort of, poetry about what we're thinking and feeling. But that wasn't the case back in the early 50s when Sylvia went into the mental hospital. And she started writing about her thoughts and feelings coming out of that experience. And I thought, well, isn't that wonderful? Because not only was she doing it at that time, there was Anne Sexton and Robert Lowell. They were also writing about sort of confessional poetry. And it dawned on me that this movement wasn't born in like a university or sort of this quaint little town. It was actually born in mental hospitals, primarily in New York and in Boston. And I was like, well, that is a story I really want to tell.
Wow, that's like, what a story of inspiration, which also totally connects to the book itself, in which inspiration is such a theme. Like, it's clearly something you think about. Where does it come from, and how does it relate to, say, competition, which is another big part of kind of how the plot moves. The book, it starts with this beautiful series of openings. Like, first you have, outside the book, the reader opens it. And then in the first scene, there's this curator who opens a box, and inside the box is not quite a manuscript, not quite a book, which is important. And it's so great because it gives this feeling of this kind of infinite discovery of like treasures inside treasures, stories inside stories. And I'm just so impressed by how you structured this book. And I was hoping you'd tell me more about talk to me about how you built that structure, and maybe particularly about your decision to have 3 narrators.
Yeah. So, I knew early on that this book was going to be told from the point of view of multiple protagonists, and actually in particular, 2 protagonists and 1 antagonist. And so I also knew that I wanted to write about Sylvia Plath, but not from her perspective. I wanted to show how different people were affected by Sylvia Plath and her work, and also how different people affected her. So going into it from the very beginning, I knew that there were going to be multiple sort of pathways into the life of Sylvia. And so I was like, well, in the beginning, we need to see her inspiration. We need to see the person who sort of instills in her the desire to pick up a pencil and write about what she's thinking and feeling. And in real life, there was this, she had a psychiatrist named Dr. Ruth Barnhouse. She actually appears in The Bell Jar as Dr. Nolan, who I think is the unsung hero of The Bell Jar. She comes in at the end, and she becomes sort of the mother figure of Sylvia Plath's, protagonist. And in real life, that's what Ruth Barnhouse was for Sylvia. So in the novel, my novel, you have Sylvia sort of arriving at McLean Hospital, having just gone through, having a mental break, and she can't read and she can't write. She can't even pick up a pencil. And so you have Ruth Barnhouse kind of coming in and teaching her how to express herself and to express her thoughts and views in a way that society around her had told her not to do. So I knew that Ruth was going to be a primary character. But then you sort of move on, and 10 years later, you have Sylvia Plath sort of coming into her own, and she's, at that point, she encounters a character named Boston Rhodes, who becomes her primary competition. And where Ruth Barnhouse sort of sees Sylvia as somebody to mold and to take care of, Boston Rhodes sees Sylvia as somebody to tear down. And so we have these sort of competing forces sort of shaping Sylvia as we sort of move through. And of course, you have the third storyline, which is the modern storyline of an auction house curator who is looking at the past and the growth of Sylvia Plath and wondering, well, how do I preserve her legacy, and what is my obligation in this whole equation, this whole relationship? And it sort of leaves her with these big questions that sends her on her own sort of journey. So putting this book together was sort of like clockwork. Each of the storylines had to work like gears of a clock. Mm-hmm. And each scene sort of informs the next one, and the next one informs the next one, but they also sort of loop back and inform the past. And so it's this circular sort of cyclical sort of pattern. And if one scene doesn't work, the next 5 scenes don't work either. And so everything had to work like clockwork, which of course made it incredibly difficult to do.
Yeah.
So I was sort of happy to see that it came together in the end.
I can relate to that with writing mostly along the structure of whodunits, which also has that puzzle pieces fitting together. It makes me think, I don't know if you've ever gotten this question, but a question comes up sometimes in book events. Are you a plotter or a pantser? And the first time I was asked this, I had to have it explained to me that, a plotter is someone who really needs to have, a color-coded outline and exact structure of the book before you even start trying to write beautiful sentences. Whereas a pantser is someone who writes by the seat of their pants, who really have to just launch into a scene and let that scene inspire them, and then figure it out as they go. So it sounds like you are solidly a plotter. Did you get it as much in focus as possible before you really?
God, I'm so glad you explained what that was, because I had no idea. So I would say, okay, this is what winds up happening. When I talk about process, what happens for me is I plot. I need to know where I'm going. And I spend my first draft, about 10 months plotting. And it's like not just an outline, it's sort of like an ugly first draft that is basically, some scenes are basically like, then this happens. And then I go through with the second draft and I realize, okay, my plotting does not work at all. And then I spend the next 10 months freaking the hell out because I don't know what I'm doing. And I sort of running around with my head in the dark and just bumping into walls and pulling things together. The third draft starts to come together and I realize, okay, the outline I was using sort of worked, but not really. And then all of a sudden I start rewriting the outline and it starts coming together and coming together and coming together. And this one was, there were revelations that happened 2/3 of the way through the third draft where I realized, okay, now I know where this is going. Now I've got to go back and rewrite half of the book again. So it sort of tells you where you need to go as you're doing it. So it's sort of an amalgamation of both of those sort of processes.
That really resonates. I totally, yeah. And you have this fantasy that you can just make the outline and the structure and then write to it. But then, once you start writing things, I don't know what your experience has been. But part of what pulls is like you have a character who you sort of need to do something. And then it kind of feels like that character, you can't make them do it or it doesn't. And that for me, that's a big one that leads to that having to stop and look for the problem.
I got a question for you, since you do mysteries as well. do you know where you're going to end? Like, who did it at the end? Do you know where you're going from the beginning when you're writing?
Yes, absolutely. Like the first idea for the book is like who dies and who did it. Like that's
I did the same thing. I did the exact same thing. And I knew from the very beginning how this was going to end. Um, and it's really interesting because, like, to me, it just seemed like this was the logical way the book was going to end. But, people, the people who are reading it are always sort of blown away. I've actually gotten some angry email from people saying, I never expected it to end this way. Why did this happen?
oh wow.
And it's sort of like, it's really interesting the responses you sort of get. But I feel the same way. It's sort of like you sort of know where you want to go. And then the characters, you sort of hope that they sort of find their way toward that ending.
Exactly. That's but now it's so hard to avoid spoilers now. I found the ending like, I didn't know what was going to happen, but when it did, it felt inevitable, which to me comes so much from that it being built and constructed like a piece of architecture.
Thank you.
Yeah. What was it? There was something I had just thought of, but then I forgot. Oh, mystery. Yeah. Speaking of mystery genre, it in some ways the book is mystery. And even, there's the great line at the beginning of, I think the first time we meet Boston Rhodes writing the letter, where she writes basically, there was a motive, there was a weapon, so you're using this toolbox of mystery. And I was curious, as I was reading, because there's so much else going on, you weren't like fitting yourself exactly into the mystery formula. Yeah. Were there times through the writing process when you felt yourself like, had you planned for it to be more of a mystery and then it pulled away from that a little more, or did it kind of go the other way around?
Yeah, it's so interesting. You and I were just talking right before we started about Michael Chabon. And one of the things that I remember early on listening to him when he spoke was he has a lot of trouble with genre, being fit into that mold of genre. And he's moved into it beautifully for, like the Yiddish Policeman's Union and things like that. But when you look at some of his early works, it's very hard to sort of fit into that genre field. I knew that there was going to be a central mystery in the novel, mainly because I was mostly curious about it, as Sylvia as well. When I looked at her life, I saw it as a mystery. But I never really saw this as a mystery novel per se. So as I'm working on this and as it's moving forward, it just sort of happened. It sort of naturally took on that path of well, how did the manuscript wind up where it did? Who had it? Where did it come from? What was the significance of it, going where it was going to go, and ultimately, what it became. And the story itself sort of bloomed from the seeds of mystery, but I also wanted it to be something else. I wanted it to be an intergenerational sort of love story. I wanted it to be sort of a journey sort of story as well. And so it's hard. I have, when I'm teaching, fiction, a lot of people go back to this book, which I think is a terrific book. It's called Save the Cat. And a lot of people use it. I have it on my desk somewhere. Here it is. It's Save the Cat, writes a novel. It basically talks to you about like the 7 or 8 genres. And people sort of plot out their novels using, these sort of genres. And I'm like, yeah, that works great. That works really well. I've never been really good at fitting sort of my ideas for a novel into those sort of shapes. So I think that when you read like The Last Confessions of Sylvia P., you're going to find elements of mystery, elements of detective, novels, of elements of, art, books about literature and familial sort of stories. And so, yeah, that's sort of how I've kind of come at it.
That's really how it felt to me. It felt like reading a novel by someone who really understood like what exists in the toolbox of mystery, and you could like take some things from it and use it really well, but it didn't read as a mystery, as someone who consumes a whole lot of this.
Yeah. I wish I could write mystery. I would love to. I have ideas for mystery novels. but I would have to do major research like on how to do it to do it well, because I don't think I particularly be very good at doing it straight. And I don't know, I think it's even like some of my favorite musicians are the ones who don't do rock and roll straight, or they don't do folk music straight. It's sort of they bring in the blues, and they bring in the jazz, and they bring in the 1950s rock along with the 1990s rock, and they sort of mesh it together. I mean, I just listened to Malcolm Gladwell's 5-hour sort of interview really with Paul Simon.
Cool.
And what makes Paul Simon so interesting to me is he takes a smattering of so many different genres. I mean, if I were to ask you, what kind of musician is Paul Simon, he's not really folk music, and he's not really traditional music, and he's not really rock music, but he's all of those at the same time. And I think that that's sort of where my head winds up going with a lot of these sort of things.
I have a question about research, which is in writing sort of historical books that require a lot of historical research, I find that there is a time when I have to force myself to step away from the research and just be in my story. And it's kind of a wrench, because if you're so fascinated by the topic and what has inspired the story, you can kind of just exist there forever. And at some point you almost have to push it away or let it go. And I was wondering what your experience with that was. Did you have to really kind of step away from what you knew, and when?
God, that's a great question. There was a definitive moment for me. There really was. So we go back to the character of Boston Rhodes, who, when you read the novel, she sort of, she meets Sylvia Plath at a critical time when Sylvia is in Robert Lowell's sort of poetry workshop. And here's Boston Rhodes, who's this character who's 30 years old. And she'd never really discovered poetry until she was 30. And then she turned out to be really, really good at it, and is, primed to become sort of the leader of the confessional poetry movement, until Sylvia Plath comes in. And Sylvia is younger, more famous, more talented. And Boston Rhodes' character is absolutely Anne Sexton, at least in the early versions of her, right? And so one draft of this, it was Sylvia Plath versus Anne Sexton, who was obviously a very real poet. They had a wonderful relationship that was full of rivalry and love at the same time. And if you even look at their poetry, both during that workshop era and right after, they're almost talking to one another with poems. Sylvia would write a poem about bees and beekeepers, and then Anne Sexton would write poems about beekeepers. And Sylvia would write a poem about her deceased father, and Anne Sexton would write a poem about her deceased father, and they would sort of go back and forth, then compete and sort of lovingly sort of jab at each other, but also help them become the poets that they ultimately became. But I also knew that Anne Sexton's character, I needed her to be more. I needed her to be to really go to dark places that I couldn't in good faith have her go. And all of a sudden it sort of dawned on me, like, you know what? I don't need Anne Sexton to be in this novel anymore. I can let go of the research of who she was. I had read everything that she wrote, every journal, every book, every piece of poetry, and I walked away from it. And I was like, and as soon as I did that, I realized I became a novelist, because I could go into that realm of what if, and I could let go of the guardrails. And then that's when the book really came alive. So I think that was the moment. There was a real sort of lightning strike moment.
Wow, what a great answer. That's like goosebumps. The relationship between them, without giving away too much, is just, it's incredible. And the two things that you brought up were some of the things that stood out most to me, that there's so much potential for love and support and friendship. They have this connection, this ability to have these conversations, but the toxicity that's undermining it is just so powerful as well. And the scenes where Boston Rhodes is undermining Sylvia to the group are just so painful and nasty and wonderful written in the best way.
I tell you that somebody told me one time, it was one of my early teachers told me, that you want characters that are that are deeply flawed. And those, it turns out, are the best characters to write about. I had the best time going to that evil,
Oh,
evil
yeah.
place with her. And, and it is totally different than who I am, but it's super fun to go into that sort of that realm of toxicity and, tension, subtext, right? Like, working with subtext can be super fun when you're working with evil characters.
Oh, yeah. Well, and speaking of who you are, I was thinking as I was reading it and reading a little bit about your biography that you teach writing and fiction specifically, and there are scenes in the book of teachings, like Lowell lecturing about writing, specifically in the context of this confessional poetry movement. But I was wondering where, I believe that writers, we end up in our books kind of everywhere, even sometimes when we don't know it, but where do you see yourself most in the book?
Yeah. I see myself actually as not as the teacher in any way, shape, or form. I see myself as the curator in the book, because I really started out, well, I should say that the curator in the book, it's a modern storyline. She comes into these 3 notebooks that are, connected to Sylvia Plath, and she knows just enough about Sylvia Plath, but not enough that, like, not enough to call herself an expert. And that was absolutely me going into this. I knew about as much as any person who had ever read her stuff, but I didn't know much about her. And so I sort of, the question, someone asks her at the beginning of the novel is, why is Sylvia Plath so relevant? Is she relevant at all anymore? And that was a question I was sort of asking myself as I was going through this. Like, if you're going to write a whole novel about Sylvia Plath, you have to answer that question. How is Sylvia relevant 60 years, almost 60 years after her death? And the fact is, like, boy, she's more relevant than ever. In fact, the beauty of Sylvia Plath is that she's never been not relevant. And that's what made confessional poetry so amazing to me, because she was able to cut through all the noise and talk about the things that make us all human. And those things haven't changed, and they never will change. So when you pick up a poem from Ariel, where she's talking about thoughts of harming herself, or thoughts of loss, or lust, those are as true now as they were back then. They could have been written yesterday. They could have been written during the pandemic. So that's where I found myself and saw myself in the novel. Robert Lowell, as the teacher in this, he's wonderful, because he's so, it's sort of cliche to say that a character is complex, but you see that he's so capable of love and compassion, and he just wants to help his students, and he wants to help Sylvia, and he wants to help Boston Rhodes, and at the same time he's suffering just like these characters are with bipolar disorder, and we see him at his worst. And all of these sort of things that equally lead to their downfall also lead to their greatness. And that was something I really wanted to play with, specifically in this novel.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You were mentioning the poems, which I should confess that Sylvia Plath is a bit of a gap in my in my knowledge. I've read The Bell Jar, but not much of the poetry. And there was an image that you used very powerfully in Last Confessions, which was scenes with bees in them. And I was trying to remember, because I don't think I remember bees in The Bell Jar, though I might just be forgetting. But I the bees, they appear several times, but at one of the sort of emotional climaxes of the book. And I was wondering, where did the bees come from?
Yeah, the bees, so you'll see as you read it, the bees do make sort of like thematic sort of, they appear in certain parts, and there's like you said, there's an emotional climactic sort of moment or two where bees and beekeeping sort of come into play. Part of it was Sylvia had written a sequence of bee poems that I just thought were beautiful. They're slice of life moments of people sort of going out into the fields and going to these bee boxes and sort of cultivating the honey, and they're emotionally raw. They're not her typical sort of confessional sort of poems, but they were absolutely beautiful. And I knew that I wanted to incorporate them into the book in some way, shape, or form. And it becomes a metaphor for mental illness. I mean, Ruth Barnhouse, her psychiatrist, winds up taking Sylvia and her cohort basically out of the ward and into the fields outside behind the mental hospital. And where they sort of, instead of doing traditional psychotherapy, they work with the bees, and they work with their hands with the bees. And this acts as sort of a therapeutic tool to help sort of cultivate their inner love of living. But it also becomes something more. In my mind, the idea of mental illness, if we think about it, isn't really something, this is sort of controversial, but I've never seen or viewed mental illness as something we cure. We can't contain it. We can treat it. We can have windows of clarity and windows where, it's not really affecting our lives as much as it is in other points. But mental illness in general isn't really, it's something we live with. We're human. Everybody has sort of these sort of things happen to us, whether it's trauma or depression or anxiety or any of this stuff. It is always there within us. And so this idea that we can sort of tame the bees or tame the mental illness it's not true. It's just an illusion. And so when we see the bees sort of hovering outside of the bee box or the bee boxes, we have this sense that we are cultivating the bees, that we have trained them, that this is their home. But in reality, it's an illusion. And that's mental illness. So throughout the novel, when we see that, when the bees sort of show up, to me, it always seemed like this, the futility of trying to wrangle something that while it looks beautiful and tameable, is absolutely out of our control. And that's Sylvia Plath, right? She wore her mental illness on her sleeve and in her pages and in her pen. You couldn't contain it. But of course, you have all these characters in the novel who sort of believe that they can try to, and they fail time and time again.
Mm-hmm. And that's connected to and is such a through line in the book, the connection between mental illness and art and creation, that this is Sylvia's work is coming from the time she spends in this asylum. You have the mad poet Lowell and all these connections. So were you thinking about specifically the connection between mental illness and creativity and art?
You almost have to. I mean, there's just sort of unspoken belief that mental illness and art and creativity go hand in hand. So much so that I actually looked it up one time. I was like, I gotta see, is there evidence that this is true? And the evidence actually shows, this is sort of, paradoxical, but there is no real connection, with one exception, maybe two, where creativity and madness go hand in hand. And I thought that was really surprising, except in the case of bipolar disorder or manic depression. For some reason, there's actually there is a quantifiable link between bipolar disorder and creativity. That actually truly does exist. They've measured this. It has something to do with the ability to go from a manic state and a depressed state, and also sort of express ourselves in that without any sort of confines. That's true. And now we're going to go really deep. If you think about Sigmund Freud, I don't profess to be a Sigmund Freud enthusiast, but I do know that Freud is very famous for his defense mechanisms, the idea of that we do things mostly non-consciously to defend ourselves against hurt and pain, like deflection and projection and things like that. But there's actually one form of defense mechanism that's really, really good for us. It's called sublimation. And the idea is that you take all the pain and hurt and you pour it into art. So there's a treatment, there's a sort of a reaction to, I should say, to grief, that we actually sort of pour into art as well. So those two things there is that sort of connection. And then, thirdly, I would say that, I mean, this as well as anybody, that when we're writing, when we're creating, it is the closest thing to madness that I can possibly imagine, because in what other profession are we allowed to invent rooms and people and conversations, dialogue that doesn't really exist at all. And it's make it so realistic that people will actually pick up the book and read our madness as well. I think it's sort of self-inflicted and societally approved madness, which I love actually.
Yeah, yeah. So Boston Roads, it was so great hearing you talk about that transition and that moment from, having Anne Sexton and moving to, so Boston Roads is fictional, right?
Yes, she becomes totally fictional.
Yes. And so, but you have poetry and lines from Boston Roads that are interspersed and that are very, as you can tell, I was like, oh, am I getting this right? Is she fictional? So you composed. And what was that like?
It's so funny. The book came out this week, and people keep on asking me, like, do you write poetry? Because I read about poets. I've never written poetry in my life. I don't think I could. But I spent 3.5 years working on this novel, and I spent a year in each character, basically writing each character. If you listen to, if I pull up my phone right here, there's actually there are recordings of me dictating into my phone dialogue and plot points and from the voices of these characters. And I think that I think that's where it sort of comes from. It's the poetry sort of developed from being within almost sort of method acting. And I just sort of, I saw the world when I was, in Boston Roads sort of situation. I actually saw the world through her eyes. I got it. Like I really, really did. The vengeance, the bitterness, the desire, it was all there. And so, I don't write full poems for her, but they're actually snippets, and her poems, sort of the lines from her poems sort of start each section of the novel. And they sort of lead into sort of the thematic sort of relevance of each section. I don't know where that came from. And I don't mean to make that sound coy or more metaphysical or anything than or genius or anything like that. I honestly don't know where it came from. And I have to believe that just the character sort of just arose, when she needed to, and when I needed poems to sort of manifest, there they were, and she really just came through. That's why I really, you asked me which character do I see myself in. I mean, yeah, I see the curator. Actually, I think I see myself in Boston Roads too, out of necessity in some ways.
Did you need a sort of a buffer as you toggled between characters? Did you have to kind of spend a week just with Boston Roads and give yourself the space, or could you do the shift pretty quickly?
I needed the space in between. Each of these characters is so different. Yeah. What really came together for me was learning the voice and mannerisms of each of these characters. It really is like method acting. Once I understood their mannerisms, the way that they saw the world, who they were and how they acted, how they talked and walked, then I could tell their stories, and through their points of view. I couldn't toggle between the two. So I literally, each storyline was written separately, merged together, and then sort of intricately sort of pieced together as it went along. And I mean, it's as much a science as it was an art.
Sure. Oh, that's fun. I love stories about piecing things together. I'm like, was it color coded?
Oh my God, I know, right?
Yeah. Sounds so organized. I had one more question. The Boston Roads. It was more a comment to say that you were also, besides going from into the different characters, you have these different modes of first person narration. Boston Roads is writing these letter that has an agenda, and then yes. The doctor is writing in the form almost of kind of a medical journal, which is such a different, and then you have a more almost omniscient narrative voice for the other character, which is also a huge switch just stylistically to go between those three.
That's exactly what I meant. I mean, it's almost like, genre wise, I mean, in my head, I was like, it's mystery, it's medical journal, it's confessional letter, all of this sort of merged together. And the only thing I can think of to sort of describe the style I was going after was, if you've ever read the works of David Mitchell. A lot of writers these days are sort of sort of name checking him a lot, but he was one of the original guys who was writing multiple storylines with the cohesive arc over them. And he did it, and he does it. He's a miracle worker when it comes to this sort of genre storytelling. Cloud Atlas was a huge influence on me when I read it. The idea was that you have basically 7 stories, and they're split down the middle. And so, and they go all through time. They span time, and they span genres. And each story is either a mystery, sci-fi, political espionage, sort of a thriller, and yet they all work in this sort of like beautiful clockwork sort of way to create this sort of tapestry. And then, as a result, you've got things like, I'm looking at my bookshelf over here. You've got the Overstory by Richard Powers. He borrows that completely with this brilliant book that won the Pulitzer a few years ago. Cloud Cuckoo Land, which just came out. Anthony Doerr does the exact same thing. It's 3 for him. It's 3 storylines. One is, sort of medieval sort of storyline. One's a present day storyline, and one takes place 1,000 years in the future. And they all sort of merge together. I'm reading another novel right now called How High We Go in the Dark, which is brilliant. And it's incredible. And it starts 30 years from now, and it goes all the way to 1,000 years. And it's, different genres all merged together with a single cohesive story over it. And I think David Mitchell was one of the guys who started this. And I remember reading Cloud Atlas. I remember reading, his original, and the name of his first book sort of escapes me at the moment, but it was Ghostwriter. What he did was he just sort of broke the mold when it comes to how to tell these sort of expansive, beautiful stories. And this was sort of, The Last Confessions of Sylvia Plath seemed to me like it needed that sort of structure to be told correctly.
Well, not to, I would never knock David Mitchell, because I'm also a huge fan. At the same time, reading Cloud Atlas, sometimes you get into moments with it where you could almost be in a short story where there's like a separateness. And Last Confessions of Sylvia Plath just read, it was so smooth. Like there was never a moment where it felt like jarring or like a transition was even happening, and yet underneath it you were making these huge transitions. So I just think you did an excellent job.
That means a lot. Thank you. That was actually what I was trying to do as well. I was trying to make it so it was, it was a seamless story that sort of built into each other almost seamlessly. So that is the biggest compliment I think I've gotten. So thank you very much for that.
You are so welcome.
I see something coming up here. Here we go.
Here we go.
Hello.
Hello, everyone. Well, we are actually just heading into our Q&A session now. So if anybody has any questions, please feel free to pop them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. I will check the chat too, just to be safe. I do see we actually have a comment here mentioning that we have someone all the way from Alabama at our event. Good evening from Michael in Alabama. So we've got people from everywhere.
I think it's one of the nice things about doing Zoom events, right? It's like we're global. We're doing a global broadcast.
Yeah, I guess we didn't even mention where we're from, but because I'm in St. Louis, Missouri, you're in California.
And you're not even in Boston, you're in Philly.
It is true. We've got it all covered. The whole map. Yeah. I think that's appropriate to have the different layers. It kind of goes along with the story.
It does. We all blur together. It's beautiful.
Exactly. I actually had some questions for you as well that I was curious about. I don't want to make sure I'm not cutting anybody else off. I'll keep my eye on the Q&A as well. But one thing I was wondering is, Lee, you were mentioning how it was really important for you to have these kind of multiple pathways into Sylvia's life. And I found myself wondering, why was that so important?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. When you think about Sylvia and her work, we all have different ways that art affects us. Like there's a line in the book that says, we all know that poetry is supposed to move us, but we don't really, no one ever tells us how it's supposed to move us. And that's really the way I came about, I wanted to get into the story of Sylvia Plath. I wanted to show how different people were affected different ways by the art of Sylvia Plath. And it speaks to a sense of ownership too. How do we each own a piece of what Sylvia gives us? And so you have this story of somebody who becomes protective of the art. And then you have somebody who becomes envious and ravenous over the art. And then you have somebody else who just wants to own the art, to show off to the world and hide it away and say, it's mine and no one else can have it. So you have all these sort of different people. It's almost prismatic because you need to see the different ways that art moves us.
It's quite beautiful. It's making me think too about how I've often heard it said that, once you read a poem, that's yours too. Not just the poets anymore, not just the writers. So making me think about that. I was also wondering, kind of going off that, I'd actually read a bunch of reviews mentioning that although this isn't from Sylvia's perspective, people are feeling like you capture her voice all the same in your writing. And so even with the different perspectives too, with different characters. And one thing I was wondering, was that kind of in your mind going into this, or is it something that just kind of organically happened as you were writing?
I wanted to take care of, this is my bias. I wanted to take care of Sylvia Plath. I wanted to be very, very judicious with her voice and make sure that when she spoke, it was important, and that everything that she said was like, it was meaningful. And so I didn't want to overuse her. And so, but there were moments when I sat down to write, and again, I don't mean to make it sound more sort of spiritual or holy, if you will, than it really was. But there were moments when I sat down and, there were about 5 or 6 really cohesive, long scenes with Sylvia directly, interacting with my main characters. And when I used her voice, I was really careful and very aware of it. I felt like, okay, here I go. I've got the golden egg, and I've got to treat it with respect, and I got to do this right. And capturing her voice was super hard. And I needed to do it right. And sometimes she says things that are awful, but it still had to be true. And so when I sort of got into those moments, I was really, really careful and very sort of like, deliberate in those sort of creative spaces.
Wow. I mean, it sounds like the thoughtfulness and the intention behind it really seems to have paid off. I find myself thinking too a little bit about, with your background in counselor psychology and how that might have impacted your approach to writing her voice as well.
Well, when it comes to counseling psychology, you see there's a tremendous sense of empathy when you're working with anybody. And there's something called unconditional positive regard. And that is, it's really hard to do, but it's something you sort of have to live and breathe, where you see the good in everybody. And so, somebody used to, I had, this is a true story. When I was first starting out, before I became a writer or a published writer, I made my training, and this young man shows up into my office, and he walks in, he's wearing full regalia of a Nazi uniform with a hat, Mein Kampf in his hand, and he sits down in my office, and I was like, and shaved head, and I was like, so how are you doing? We start talking, and I asked him about the book that he's folding, and I said, is it problematic that that I'm Jewish? And he said, no, why would it be a problem? I mean, and all of a sudden you start to really build a rapport with somebody who's got some really screwed up beliefs, obviously. So when you're working with somebody like Sylvia, when you're writing about her, I came at it from a place of, boy, this is somebody who's real and suffering and had hopes and dreams and desires, and real pain. And so the empathy that sort of went into crafting her as a character, a 3-dimensional character, was when I took it real seriously.
Thank you for that.
Yeah.
was wondering too, you had mentioned when you were mentioning some of the angry feedback you had gotten about the ending. And I know, Elsa, you said, well, this just seemed like the natural conclusion. And yet some people are saying, why did you do this?
Yeah. Yeah.
It's making me think, have you received any feedback, whether it's constructive, like maybe you could call that constructive, or a compliment that has been kind of especially meaningful to you?
No, I mean, I think it's actually great that people are sort of divided how it ends. You know, I mean, that's sort of what you want. You want people to sort of be left with like, wait a second, how did that happen? Why did that happen? To me, it seemed like the natural way to go. And I was worried that people were going to see it coming from a mile away. But it's like, it's the exact opposite, which I love. I think it's, you want it to be that way.
I feel like that's what they always tell you for a good thesis. You have to be able to argue kind of either which way.
Yeah, exactly. That's it.
I do see we have a question here saying, hi from St. Louis. As you were researching for this book, what surprised you the most? What did you not expect to learn about Sylvia, and perhaps even change the direction of your story? And they also mentioned that this is a very stimulating discussion. So thank you.
Oh, thank you. What did I learn about Sylvia? I learned what I didn't know was that she had started out, she was preternaturally good. This was somebody who was, now her father died when she was 8 years old. And it's no coincidence that she wrote her first poem when she was 8 years old. And she got it published when she was, I think, close to 12 years old. And not just like in the school newspaper, but in the local city paper. I mean, this is somebody who was so good and so natural at what she did. You read her journals. I mean, if I wrote a journal, it would be like, this is what I did today, and this is what I felt like. She went on and on and on. And it wasn't like this manic sort of diatribe. It was describing the details within the details and how it made her feel. And it was all sort of melodic in how she saw the world. I think that that's really how she saw things. It's how she saw things no matter what state of mind she was in. She saw everything as poetry, as music, as being something to be swept up in. It was just quite beautiful.
I'm thinking about, Sylvia as a writer, and also a lot of times we do have writers in our audiences as well. I'd feel remiss if I didn't ask, especially since you are a teacher as well, kind of if you have any kind of advice for folks who are maybe writers and hoping to be published at some point too.
Yeah. Some advice I got early on was, just write the book, right? There's some truth in that. The other thing is, I always write with my shoes on. I do. I wake up every morning, I get dressed and I put my shoes on and I sit down and write every day. It's a job. And, as much as it is an art, and it really is an art, but it's really a job. And if you take it seriously, that's the only way that you're going to get there. When I worked in book publishing, there were people who randomly fell into writing books. And it does happen. There are people who just spit out a book. I sat and I wrote for 6 months and the book got published and it was great. But I don't necessarily think that those are the ones that last. I mean, sometimes they are. I mean, and I don't mean to disparage those sorts of writers. I think those are wonderful writers. But I think that if you take it with a sense of seriousness and you sort of study the craft, you can do something that hopefully that lasts a little bit. And I hope my book lasts. But in general, though, I think that to understand the rules of writing and to approach it as you would any other profession is definitely your first step toward becoming a writer.
That's very helpful for me to hear as someone who spent a lot of the last 2 years with my pajamas on writing.
But did they have were they footy pajamas? Because if that counts, that counts as shoes.
Sad footless pajamas. But
oh my goodness.
Really in good company.
It's a pandemic. The pandemic, all rules are off. No,
but I do like that. That is helpful for me to hear in this moment.
That's
Thank you
great.
for that. And I do
You
want to
got it.
mention, oh,
Oh, I was just going to say, Elsa, I want to ask you, what are you working on right now?
I am working on, for the first time, writing not a whodunit or mystery. So feeling my way into like outside. We were talking about genre. I have felt like genre is my safe place. Like I writing within the structure and confines of the mystery formula has just been such a like delight to me. I like the restrictions. So not doing that is terrifying in some ways, and also a moment of kind of a lot of new energy and excitement, and almost feeling like I'm writing for the first time again. But yes, moving more away from historical fiction as well, and into kind of more magical fantasy world.
Ooh, I love it. And you're doing it without the guardrails, so it's a little bit, edgy. No, I love it.
A little bit closer to that, yeah, that pantser mentality. I don't even have an outline. Like, it's crazy.
This is going to be awesome. I can't wait to read it.
Thank you.
we have one more question that just popped up, which I think we can sneak in before the end.
Yeah.
Wondering for you, Lee, if any of your readers share how they came to be attracted to Sylvia Plath. This particular reader mentions how, for me, there's a level of fragility.
So I'm so sorry. Say that one more time.
Do any of your readers share how they came to be attracted to Sylvia Plath?
Yeah, a lot of people have said that they see themselves in her poetry. They read The Bell Jar when they were younger, middle school or high school, and they've always seen themselves in her, and which is really interesting because The Bell Jar is basically the story of a woman suffering a mental break and going to a hospital, getting better, and kind of coming into her own. That's like it's a basic storyline, but people see themselves in every part of the book. They see themselves as somebody who's been misunderstood, somebody who feels trapped, somebody who feels that they've been sort of pushed into a corner and said, this is what you're supposed to be or how you're supposed to be. The idea of, do we get married? Do we have children? Or is that somehow like letting a part of us die? Those are universal questions that I think everybody sort of relates to. So when I appear and I start talking about The Bell Jar, when people do come up and they ask me about, an attraction to Sylvia Plath's work, they'll often confide that, gosh, I haven't read this book since I was a teenager, but I still think about it quite a bit. And I think it's because it's, the ideas that she brings up and the scenes that she sort of conjures are those that are so universal, and they stay with us no matter how old we are. So I think that that's where most people discover Sylvia, and why Sylvia, like she did for me, just sort of lives in the ether of who I am and who we all are.
That's kind of beautiful to think about, the kind of connections you can even make with readers through Sylvia that way.
Yeah.
And that takes us to our end, where I would thank everybody for being part of our community and connecting with us tonight through this conversation and through your thoughtful questions and conversation. Lee and Elsa, was truly a pleasure to have both of you. I'm so happy we were able to celebrate your novel. Congratulations, and thank you all so much for joining us again. For anyone who would like to purchase books, you can do so through the page where you registered for the event through 9 a.m. tomorrow morning, or stop into our store and they are likely on our shelves. I'm just popping the link in the chat again, just in case anyone wants to visit it. But thank you so much, and hope to see you all again soon.
Thank you, guys. Thanks for having me. Elsa, you were wonderful. Thank you.